Martha, and thanks, Rowan, for the introduction. Really happy to be here. It's my first time to Carleton. So great to talk to many of you this morning and over lunch, and just to hear about how things work. Okay. Just to hear how things work at different institutions. I think that's one of the most fun things about being able to visit other places is, oh, how do your students decide on their majors, and how do they get help and advising? And it's all so interesting. Our institutions are really different, which is one reason why we're trying to make this project be bigger than one institution, because doing work at one institution can only tell you so much about things like inclusive teaching and equity and so on. So like Martha said, I am a chemistry professor of teaching. I've been doing that since about the mid-2000s and have worked to transform courses to implement additional structure, to incorporate more active learning. UBC, we were lucky to have a decade-long initiative to enhance active learning in science classes through the Carl Wyman Science Education Initiative. So we have that kind of strong culture of active learning. Of course, teaching and learning are complex. We haven't solved all of the problems that we have with supporting students and ensuring that they can be successful. That's why it's also a really interesting space to do work in, because you can always tweak things and iteratively improve them. And in my associate dean role, I am working on our curriculum. We have a science center for learning and teaching, which I feel really grateful to have. We have embedded experts in all of our departments who work with faculty directly on enhancing learning in their classes. We also have some science programs. And while, EDI and decolonization is not specifically in my role, it is infused into everything we do, right? So all of those things, we're trying to think about how to advance those goals. And so I do my work on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. And while our project isn't centered on indigenizing and decolonizing our curriculum, certainly when I'm going to talk about student identity and demographics, we're inclusive of lots of things. And the project I'll be sharing about today is really something that we've started last year, which is looking at equity and inclusion across mostly first-year science courses at some Canadian institutions. And I'm going to plant the seed that, this institution could get involved as well if you want. So happy to answer questions about that as we go along. But who are we? I'll start with that. It's working. Hold on. First slide change is always the hardest. Yes. Okay. So we call ourselves the Canadian Consortium of Science Equity Scholars. We do have a website, but it is under construction. This year, we probably underestimated how much work it would be to start collecting data at 5 institutions. The website's coming, so definitely go there for updates. It'll be great once it exists. And so far, we have these 5 institutions. We were able to get a SSHRC Partnership Development Grant to kind of formalize our work together, give us a little bit of funding to have a project coordinator, a postdoc, some graduate students. So my side goal with this project is really to help get some funding for more discipline-based education research at our institutions, which is challenging in Canada, but exciting. So there's where we are. This is our current team, but we also work with many students. So each of these locations really could have a couple undergrads working on the projects with us or graduate students. So we couldn't fit everybody on this slide. But this really originated because at UBC, we had a program since about 2019, and Jared Stang, my colleague, used to be at UBC, and we were trying to look at equity in our courses, looking at course outcomes based on demographic variables. We're also developing some new assessment tools. And when he moved to Calgary, we thought, oh, hey, we could actually look at this at Calgary as well. And so we've kind of been building up our teams. Later, I'll show you some analysis, and really Yulia and Alexis are doing a lot of the analysis of the data. Joss is our, Qualtrics master, doing some interesting things here. And then many of you might know Arthi from U of T, and we also have all of the campuses from U of T collecting data, which is great. And excitingly, we have Evelyn at TRU. We're starting to collect data in chemistry there. And it's really great to have sort of a smaller institution. And we would like to have different kinds of institutions in our project so we can also look at that, right? So that's who we are. I don't know if this can go away. Oh, okay. Do you want me to do it?
With your clicker.
Mm-hmm. Oh. Can I not use this mouse? Sorry, I think if that stays the whole time, it would be nodding. Here we go. Ooh, look, I found the mouse. Okay, thank you. Okay, great. So the other kind of vision for this group is that we have people who are on the education side, we have people on the research side, and I really should start putting students on this figure since they're really important to the project as well, of course, and people who kind of do both, and it's a big continuum. And to me, that's really important because not everybody who joins up with us has to want to do education research or have time to do that. Maybe you're interested, and that's great and welcome, and people can learn and join. But really, we need people in the classroom. If we're going to have change, then you can't just have a bunch of people doing some analyses and not talking with people who are in these classrooms and doing work with students. So really is meant to be a big tent. And what we're really trying to do is look at equity and inclusion and learning in our classrooms in a Canadian context. So a lot of the really great literature on this topic in terms of STEM education is from the US and other countries, really inspiring and, at times, really interesting work from things are not as good as they could be point of view. We don't really have a good handle on what the situation is like in our Canadian institutions. Some things might end up being the same, some things might be very different based on our different kind of makeup of students and also our different K-12 education systems, things like that. So we think it's important to set our own course and do this work from within Canada. So what are we talking about today? I'm going to talk a little bit about equity since I like talking about that, and it's a good place to start. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the literature coming out about equitable courses. I'll give an overview of the project, what kinds of data we're collecting, share a few preliminary results, mostly collected in term one of this academic year. Not going to go back to talk about our UBC specific data that we started collecting in 2019, but there's some interesting things there. Of course, the pandemic complicated a lot of that. And then stop with a little bit about what we're hoping to do in the future and how people can get involved. So starting with this, many of you, think about EDI or DIE or DEI all the time in your work, or not very much. But of course, we think about our classes and the diverse makeups, right? One of the most challenging parts of teaching is that we're teaching to a broad variety of students. They have different interests, different background in the discipline, different priorities, different ways of interacting with other people. And so, that can be a challenge, but it's also really an asset, and why I think a lot of our STEM efforts are focused on diversity. And diversity is fine, but it's not quite enough. We want people to feel like they actually have a seat at the table, and when people, want to make decisions, people feel included in that process so that the power is really shared. And then we can think about that's wonderful, but does that truly have an impact? So the equity space is really what we're after here in terms of, well, what are the results looking like? Do we really have equitable outcomes and processes that really build on this diversity and inclusion? So this is very general. You can think about, okay, how might these things play out in my classrooms? And certainly, I think teachers have a big role to play when thinking about the extent to which people feel included in the classroom and the discipline. And then, thinking about how students differ or not in their success in courses and how that goes and influences the rest of their academic and work career is something we're really interested in. So for education, when we think about equity, there's lots of things we could point to, right? One is, okay, do we have equitable uptake of post-secondary education? Okay, that would be really great. So if we have people with different identities, whether that's gender or race, ethnicity, disability status, whatever it might be, do we have people accessing post-secondary education at similar levels? Do we retain those students? Are they staying? That would be also really important. Do we want equal learning or equivalent learning? Also good. And what about outcomes? You can have outcomes from a course, a program, a career. All of those things are at play. Our consortium is thinking really about at the course level, mainly because that's where instructors have a lot of control, right? As an instructor, I might not have a lot of control about the whole system I'm working in or what kinds of jobs my students might have access to, but we can look internally at courses. Doesn't mean we're always going to stay at that level, but that's what our grant is now to look at. And there's certainly a lot of interesting work to be done at that level as well. But there's a lot of things you can care about in this space. It might be at the course level, it might be broader, it might be access. So some of you will have seen this chart I have before, but I like starting here because it starts to get us to think about, okay, if you have students and for some reason you have two different groups and they come into your course and they leave your course, what do we want to do? What do we want those data to look like? So imagine you have two groups of students, A and B, and you have some measure of learning when they come in. You have that would be great. And then you have at the end, so course grade or final exam grade, something like that. And it doesn't really matter how the two groups differ, but they're different on some kind of measure. So just think to yourself a little bit when you look at 1, 2, 3, and 4. If this was your course, what would you want the data to look like in your own? Say again?
One line.
You can have more than one. Maybe I would like this, or if not that. Okay, so which ones look good to you? 2, okay. Do we don't like these ones? No, these look like they're more different at the end, right? Which is usually not what we're going for. Here they came in the same and then they different. So this could be, let's say the difference was major. In chemistry, we might have science students and non-science students. And so I don't really want them to be different. You can think of lots of reasons why they might be different at the end, but ideally everybody has the same chance of success in my class if possible. 3, they're also different. So people like 2, so maybe start with differences and end up all the same. So I would say that which group you're in doesn't predict your score at the end. Probably a good thing. What do you think about 1?
Well, you may have that as well.
You can have that as well. Yeah.
In some of the chemistry class, sometimes it depends on the program the students have.
Yeah, sure. So always this program.
They need more they want.
Yeah, I think that's the reality for many situations, right? So this is, people are different at the end in a proportional way to where they started or something, right? So that's okay as well. But if we think about when we have incoming students into a first year science course, maybe they differ on what lab skills they had in high school. I would really like at the end for them not to have that as a predictor of their success. Like something about my course design was able to get people up to the level where they need to be. That would be nice, right? So I think a lot of people like 2, that would be great. 1, you're not really doing anything terrible to the students, but we're not really fixing anything either, right? And of course, it would depend what these groups really are. So this is a really great paper, Rodriguez et al., talking about these models of equity, and they have kind of different frameworks and conceptions of equity. This is the equity of parity model, that at the end everybody's the same. Fairness is more, okay, we're treating everybody the same, and so we're not doing any harm. And then we have some inequalities here. So it's a great paper. If you're interested in learning more about this topic, our group learned a lot from it. And I'm an idealist, right? So I want us to get to here, but this is okay, but I really love for these kinds of incoming variables to be less strong of a prediction. I also talk a lot about equity, but it often is more true to say more equitable, right? So we're working toward this goal, but things always change a lot as well, right? So if we think about why this would be not ideal, at UBC, we have a lot of things that depend on grades. And so earlier I was telling people about our admission process for majors. I won't get into it here, but it really does depend on students' grade. You think about getting in, admission to certain majors, if you could continue in your program, scholarships, research experiences. Certainly some people might look at that. And then of course, admission to future schooling, things like that. So while we don't want to put grades as the most important things, I think we need to look at it because it does affect what happens to a student after, right? We cannot escape that fact in our current post-secondary institutions, right? If we get to a place where grades are less emphasized and fewer things depend on them, wonderful. But certainly that's not where we're at my institution. And so then we can take kind of an equity lens and look at that as well. So there might be things that depend on grades and it might be different things, fewer things, maybe there's other things. But when we continue to perpetuate these inequities, it's a far stretch to say this is going to lead to a diverse and thriving STEM community of professionals and academics and things like that. We don't want to compound issues over time. So that's certainly something we're thinking about. Many of you might have seen a graph like this, thinking about, when we have people with different characteristics, if we treat everybody the same, that's an equality framework. If we give people what they need to succeed, that is equity. And this figure is great, it's very cute, but it really does still point out like this person's shorter. There's something wrong with them, right? They just couldn't see over the fence. And some things, yes, height is kind of that kind of variable, but some things really aren't, and we sometimes think they are, right? So incoming prior knowledge of chemistry isn't really something wrong with a person if their level of incoming chemistry knowledge is lower. There was something that led to that, right? And something about their life experience that really made that a factor. So this is one common figure which really differentiates between equality and equity. Another is to think about having justice, where really those structural things are more equivalent, and then people have what they need to succeed. So this figure is not necessarily saying, oh, you're starting off because of some kind of internal difference. It's really something structural outside that then maybe we need to level. So that is certainly something like incoming prior knowledge for a class, depending on where people went to school before that, things like that. It's not really the person's fault or an internal characteristic, but it might have a big impact on how they experience your course and how they continue. So we're trying to take that framework. And so I'm showing these figures really to help you start, or to ask you to start thinking about, okay, well, what does that look like in my class? So what kinds of barriers might be influencing how students experience my class and learn in my class? And are there things I can do to put supports in place that then help address those in a way that makes it so that these groupings don't predict success or failure at the end? There's probably some things we can do. There's other definitions of equity. So we can think about some definitions from this excellent book chapter, talking about equitable access. They're using physics as an example, inclusive learning environment, equitable outcomes. And then this idea that we don't want these groupings to predict success or failure, because really whether you go on to the next course it's influenced by that. There's some really inspirational literature that we've read and thought about, and it really talks about taking this view that we want to teach with active learning. We want to get students engaged. We take this approach where students have to process the information and practice it. Peer learning can be a really important feature of that. And then layer on, oh, does that actually help people from different groups do better? So one of the studies is by Theobald and colleagues, and they were looking at active learning classes versus traditional lecture classes, and did separate students into more traditional students and what they called underrepresented minorities. This is a study in the US. And they showed that the differences were smaller for underrepresented minority students in the active learning classes. So they showed pretty convincingly that with course structure, students do better, right? The differences between those two groups are less, but in a traditional class, the differences in traditional and underrepresented minorities were greater. So it's kind of starting to move in that direction of, well, what helps, right? What helps have that demographic variable not be as strong of a predictor? Structure, active learning, feedback, peer instruction, things like that. And then when we think about other studies, you can also look at different student populations, thinking about course structure again, and other analyses have shown that between a traditional and increased structure class, students who identified as first generation did better in the high structure. Black students did better in the high structure. But remember, when we think about these variables, it's not really that thing. It's usually a proxy for something else, right? So maybe there were differences in students' incoming knowledge or something that this is helping overcome. It's also making, when we have high structured classes, making what to do more explicit. So it's not going to give just the privileged students who might have had, family members who say, oh, well, this is how you should approach university. Maybe people don't have that level of support. And so we can make that explicit for our students and enhance equity that way. There's now kind of another phase of active learning research coming out. about social dynamics. And it's very interesting because we think of two situations. If we're lecturing to students, their identities may not come up unless it's sort of really related to the course content. But when we put students together and we want them to start talking to each other and working together and constructing things, maybe then student identities become more relevant, right? So the next generation of work is really looking at how that social aspect of active learning plays out in terms of equity. So what roles do people take on in their small group work? Are there differences in gender identity, or if students are international students or not? So that's something we definitely want to look at in our Canadian context as well. And then thinking about identities from a point of view of, oh, if you're in a biology class and asked to work together in small groups, am I going to, talk about my identity in my introduction or keep that, away? And that gives students a lot to think about that's in addition to the content. So we're actually asking a lot of them. We're saying, okay, focus on this problem together, but also, have that social layer on top of that. And our project, it hopes to identify some of the aspects of what instructors can do to help that. So one thing might be, oh, well, maybe you want to have students work in the same groups for a few weeks so they get to know each other. And then there's a lower cognitive load on the social aspect so they can work effectively on the problems. For example, that might be effective. So the key takeaway here is not all students experience active learning in the same way. So it's active learning is great. We have lots of evidence that it works, but then we can think about how it's implemented as a way to enhance equity, which is very interesting to me at least. Our consortium is also, right now we have biology, chemistry, physics. We have a little bit of sub-discipline stuff going on with an ecology course. Certainly we're open to other disciplines, so geosciences, etc. But there is research on teaching approaches used most commonly in these different disciplines. So we hope by collecting data in different disciplines at different institutions, we can start to look at these effects separately. So is it an effect of the instructional approach? Is it something about the discipline in terms of disciplinary norms and the social part of that discipline? Are there some institutional rules that really impact how teaching is done? How can we really disentangle these things? And it kind of goes back to what I said at the beginning. If we just look at one course in one institution, it's really limited for what we can say. So we know that different disciplines, and mine is very traditional, the top there, in terms of how we teach. So starting to look at that as well across the scope. So a little bit here about why we're collecting sociodemographic data and what we think about it. So when we think about course outcomes, and we can just say grade, right? Course grade, what goes into that? There's probably more things than I have on the slide here. What knowledge students come in at, so prior knowledge, how they learn in the course, how much time they spend, if it's used effectively, their engagement in class, test anxiety, and there's probably more, right? So from this, we can say, okay, well, where does an identity variable fit? So if I'm saying, well, I don't want to draw gender pointing to that thing because there's nothing biologically innate about women students for being able to do chemistry or physics or math or whatever, or men, where does it fit, right? And so sometimes when we measure these sociodemographics, we're actually using them as proxies for these other things. And while I think looking at the sociodemographics is a really important step to look at evaluating equity, we might want to have a pretty good theoretical framework for what we're actually thinking about, right? So some of our earlier work, we did measure test anxiety. We are looking at some other variables as well, like sense of belonging and perception of the classroom climate, as well as the demographics to get a more informative picture, right? Because it's not good enough just to say, oh, this group is doing worse than this group. You need to kind of try to understand why, right? And that's what we're really trying to go at. So if we think about why any of these might differ, well, you might think about, socioeconomic status. Maybe that has an impact on prior learning, right? Because access to education or not, for example, access to really expensive tutors or not, big differences. Perhaps there's a gender effect in test anxiety. Maybe that's wrapped into some kind of an identity thing. Can I do math? Can I do chemistry? Things like that are important to unpack as well, because that also pinpoints to our interventions. So if we think about what's causing those things. So why, I'm kind of working backwards. We have the demographic variable and then maybe why or the reason, and then what caused that. You can kind of go back all the way. And ideally, if some of these things are caused by systemic issues, well, as a society, as we're continually evolving, those things hopefully will get better as well. So we definitely don't want to perpetuate things like racism and sexism because we're trying to be better as a society. But at now where we are, these things are still prevalent, and so they can influence how someone interacts with our discipline and so on. So we can go back all the way there, and really, I'll come back to the slide actually. Oh, I wanted another. It's a little later. Okay, I'll come back to some causes, because I think having this framework in our head as instructors helps think about, okay, there's a difference here. Maybe that's related to this, which I could also potentially measure or interview students about or something like that. And then what could I do to provide support, right? So if it's a test anxiety issue, well, maybe the greater weight my exams have, the more that influences equity. And so I can try to notch that back a little bit and see if it improves the situation, for example. Or maybe I can send strong signals when students experience failure, that normalize failure, give students really concrete things they can do to keep moving forward in their course. Maybe I can do that as an instructor and then see if it helps, right? All of those things might be important. So I have a question. So I'm talking about demographic variables. So first I'll ask, as instructors, which of these do you know about your students? If any, as instructors. Any? Zero. Yeah, it's very common to say zero. Maybe you know a little bit about gender identity, something like that, but often we don't really know who our students are. My colleagues who have come to the US are shocked at this fact because I think they're used to having access to a lot of information. So you might have read in papers, if a student is Pell eligible, that's a measure of their financial need, and instructors would know that from the beginning of course. That is not our way of doing things. It's like that for reasons. We don't really know who our students are. So it makes it hard for us to track equity. Maybe administrators or institutional research offices might have a bit more information, and they can look kind of broadly at who's at the institution, how successful they are, what the graduation rates are, maybe. And I know at UBC right now, we have some of this data from an optional survey students do. We have a binary sex at birth, gender variable. And then soon, and I am excited that you're launching a survey like this soon, we are launching our own student demographic survey for everybody. And that will be really nice to have more census level data with multiple variables with the really carefully constructed questions that then can be accessed for institutional purposes. What we're doing in this study right now is purely a research study. So we have ethics approval, we're treating it like a research study. Students consent to answer the questions or to have their data used in research and their grades used in research. So we don't have a census level picture, but it's, I think, better than nothing, as long as we're really cautious in how we interpret things and we don't sort of overstate what we have available to us. Really common not to have information like this, but we're trying to change. And like I've said a couple times now, we're not necessarily measuring something biological or causal when we look at these groups. We socially construct these things. And it's actually a really interesting field because the way we ask the socio-demographic questions evolves over time faster than we think it would. So we've already changed, a couple of our questions several times, from learning more, talking to more people, and realizing that how we were doing things is not the best. And so it's always going to change, but it makes it a really interesting kind of research question. Another thing is we don't want to ignore the variability within groups. So while we say this group is better than this group, or this group is worse than this group, of course, if the group's big enough, you have people who are doing well in all these groups, and we have people that are struggling in all these groups. And so the research questions we can ask also should point attention to that. So if there's a group we care a lot about that we want to affect their experience, well, let's do something with those students only and look at the variation. What are successful students doing in that group? What are less successful students doing? And how can we support that change? And this is going toward, we don't always have to do comparisons. It's an easy thing to do, but the risk of doing that is we really put one group on the pedestal. Like we all are supposed to be like that group. And that is problematic for many reasons, because that's really, our societal, what's valued in our society is usually toward the dominant culture instead of being more inclusive of other cultures. So we have to really be careful about that. And we're trying to be careful. I know there's a lot here. This is figure 1 from this awesome paper, which is talking about different research frameworks. We're just starting to unpack our own. What I want to point out here is that a lot of the literature you'll look at is what we call deficit framed, or it's using a deficit model. That's all the achievement gap literature. Like this group is doing worse than this group and we need to fix them, right? And it's problematic because it really says a group's not doing as well. So it points out deficiencies, really lays the blame on that group. Like, well, if you'd done something different, you would be in a better position. And it also really does, if we look only at that literature over and over and over again, it can actually increase stereotypes. We start to think there's actually something more meaningful there than it really is, right? So we've taken on kind of a framework of educational debt, which is a framework by Ladson Billings, which is looking at more the system around the student as well as what the student's doing. So looking at these differences built up over time because of something in society. And so we have a role to repay that debt. So to get to that parity outcome, we would be overcoming that debt and paying it back. So it really looks at societal causes and institutional causes, but there's no blame on the student, right? But really, I think while we framed our work in our grant, I think we're also really leading over to these asset-based frameworks as well, which is looking at how students bring their different cultures to the learning environment. Many framings of inclusive teaching are really from that ethics of care point of view that I think everyone who teaches in this room feels that strong obligation to help students, and we want to help them. And then they're coming with what they have, we're coming with what we have, and we create this excellent learning experience. That's more of the asset framed. And notice that the instructors have a strong role to play here, right? So while I can't go back and fix what happened in someone's prior educational experiences as an instructor, I can pick up where that stopped or that ended and then keep going, right? So that's kind of where we're leaning toward. And a really important part of this is also, again, looking at, centering the groups that we care about and not necessarily always centering the dominant culture. So a lot there, good paper, or good chapter. The risks of deficit framing, I already mentioned the reinforcing stereotypes. It really downplays the effect of what's around institutions, societal structures. And then it really puts the onus on the student. And while we know students have to work really hard to learn and they're in our classes and must engage and must, take control of their own lives, how we wrap education around them is really important as well, right? So it's not all up to the students, of course, to fix equity. We really need to play a big role in that. This is what we're trying to do. Instead of asking what's wrong with these students, we're thinking about the system and courses, thinking a lot about relationships of the students and their courses. And ideally, this research elevates the student voice. So we have students on our research team. They're really the ones going out and doing interviews with other students. I would love to get to a place where we're more often having the students come up with the specific research questions. And we've started to do that a little bit because they have a lot to say about this, right? And the further we kind of get from their positionality, then the more we need to work with those students. So this was a slide I thought was coming earlier. Just going back to something like prior learning, maybe there's a demographic difference there, but it might be because of something else, right? It might be because of socioeconomic status or something else. So it really does point to solutions. We can think about if the difference was in prior learning, well, of course, we go back and fix that, ideally. We can also think, oh, how am I going to help students catch up then? Maybe I can give them a 2-stage review in the first week where they work together and they learn a little bit. And then I give them some targeted things to work on depending on those results. And then maybe if this is really a difficult thing to change, maybe we reduce the importance of grades. So should this really influence what degree program students get into? That's up to an institution to decide, but it certainly does in some situations. But again, kind of going back, the demographic variable, what's it really about? What are the causes of that? And then we can maybe think about solutions is what we're trying to do. Okay, so here's our project a little bit. So we started in 2019 at UBC Vancouver. And this was a project supported by our Equity and Inclusion Office. Really, that's where we started to get a little bit used to this idea of collecting demographic data and so on. And then once we did that, we had our SHRC PDG, and that's where we're really looking at collecting data at other institutions. We just started that this year, bringing on some additional partners, and then we're looking forward to getting a partnership grant, which will be, you know, an order of magnitude more funding, and really to explore all these really interesting questions. Our grant is focused mainly on uncovering equity or inequities in first year courses, but really strongly focused on the influence of classroom climate on sense of belonging. So that's kind of our main sub question, but there's so much more you could do in this space. I hope we get the chance to continue. So we have lots of tools. Some we've adapted from the literature, some we've developed ourselves. We go through kind of a process of thinking about what we want to measure, either getting items or generating items from open-ended responses or interviews. We validate those, and this will be a continuing process. And I think also why I'm really excited for this to be multi-institutional is because we will get to do our validation studies in more than one context, which is going to give us more information about how meaningful it is to use a tool to measure these things. So that's a really important part of what we're doing. We have really a lot of our main work is questionnaire based, and we do some other interview studies, but we have 3 surveys in each course. We really strongly encourage instructors to offer a grade bonus incentive for response. Doesn't matter what students say, but just to get there, open the survey, it makes a big difference in response rate. We ask disciplinary belonging pre and post because that we're looking at a change. We ask social belonging in the middle because that's something people have experienced enough in the middle of term to say something about. Classroom climate, same thing. And then while we offer the demographics module every survey, if students have already done it, they can change it or they don't have to answer again. So we're building up this data set over the term and over the different courses at an institution as well. So that's what we do. We're running it all, you know, centrally managed process to make it easy on people because everybody's so busy. So that's what we're trying to do. And I'll not spend too much time on our measures, but it kind of goes back to, we want to look beyond grades. We don't just want to look at grades. We want to maybe start to try to explain some of these things. We think disciplinary belonging and identity is really important. So we have people, you know, say to the extent to which they agree or disagree with several statements that they're in first year, right? At UBC, for example, they don't have a major yet. At other institutions, they do. So there's some interesting differences there. And you know, how valued do they think they would be as a member of that community in the future? When we talk about social belonging, we're really thinking about active learning courses and people working together, but it doesn't matter. Even in a traditional class, people would either feel connected or not to their peers and their instructor and supported by their instructor. So some questions there. For classroom climate, this tool has had a journey. I'm not going to go into it, but you're at the CSC this year, we'll go into it. And that's a chemistry conference Allison and I will be at, right? Frequent Vancouver. Okay. And we're talking about instructors' regard for students and how they show that, support for diverse learning needs, and any barriers to connecting with people. And this has kind of evolved over time. So we're looking at that. Self-efficacy, we're kind of de-emphasizing, but these measures are from a published tool. This is a really common measure many of you have probably used before. So thinking about how students expect to succeed or not. And then we have a really comprehensive demographic question module. So we're not just looking at gender or just race and ethnicity. We're also looking at disabilities and chronic health status. We're also looking at languages spoken, first generation student or first in their family to school, and then what they have going on in their lives. Because we know that students are working more than ever. They have other commitments that are important. We're not in the situation where you can say, oh, students have 70 hours a week to work on my class, right? They just don't. So kind of looking at any differences there that we would hope to make more equitable by certain course structures. And this is aligned with what we're seeing from kind of the STEM equity literature. We need to look beyond grades. We should absolutely look at the inequities in grades, but then also what else is there that we can influence or use to explain or understand better. And there's lots of things people can do. This is in the same paper as the one before to do that. So what did we do last term? And we just finished collecting data for this term. We had 4 schools. We had over 7,000 students participate. UCalgary didn't give a bonus mark. I just want to point out what the responses were. They have a really complicated process for getting that approved, so we didn't get it done in time. This term they did. See that there's a difference. in different disciplines, and we also look at grades. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data, just a snapshot. It's a big data set. We have lots of stuff to do, but we have processed a little bit because one of the things we're doing is offering instructor reports. So every instructor who participates or has their class participate in this, they get a detailed report about all their data and how it's disaggregated. And then it's really for people who are part of our group where we can work with them a little bit, because the last thing I want is somebody to run away and be like, oh, this group is bad at chemistry. That's not the interpretation we think is helpful. So working with us and trying to, get up the training and things like that. So this is UBC only data. This is our 4 classes, and these are grades. And I'm showing gender identity. So another interesting thing is we can go beyond the binary and then build up a data set over time where we can do some statistics. We're not quite there yet. We've separated the grades into different components. So final exam, things that aren't exams like labs and homework, term exams like midterms, overall course grade, and this is a weighted average of the exams. And so what's shown here is the effect size and the significance level. And we have biology, chemistry, physics, and physics. It's not really important that you see every difference. However, what I see from this is there are differences depending on what category of score we're talking about. We don't see any statistically significant differences in the non-exam grades, but we definitely do in the exams, which is interesting. We also see some disciplinary differences, right? If you look at overall course grade, chemistry and 1 physics, the physics for science students do have a bit of a difference in male versus female or men versus women. In the final exam, everybody does. And in the favor that the men are doing better. So surprising, right? Because I feel like we're in a very, equitable society. But these data don't really tell me that. So are these differences big? They're not huge. But again, if we're ranking students and putting them into majors, this might have a big impact, right? So now our goal is to take this and try to think about, okay, what's going on there and how can we use this as a baseline to do better? I'm going to show you the charts from a paper that talked about redistributing the weight of exams. And the results are more equitable. So this is a biology study where they said, okay, if you take low versus high stakes, what are the differences in how men and women are doing? It was better when the stakes were lower. So you can think about that in terms of your course design. I was happy to hear that here, it's not like you have final exams with 8%, which is probably not great, but the lower they are, probably the better. These are little violin plots are kind of like distributions. The dot in the middle is the average, but now we're looking across our 4 schools, which I have obscured, so no one feels put on the spot too much. And we also have gender differences in course grades, and we can start to see, okay, if you compare the green to the green, and then the purple to the purple, pink looks pretty similar. So then how are these differences showing up or not across the institutions? Right, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Happy to jump on Zoom anytime and look at how we're plotting this. We can look at our other variables: climate, belonging, self-efficacy, social belonging. We develop scores. And so sometimes we have pre-post, sometimes we don't. This is biology. And so we're looking at, okay, if we think about biology at, say, UBC, what are the differences there? And then we can start to compare across our 4 schools, pre-post, and disciplinary belonging. So here I would say, okay, well, at school 1, they started different, and they also both dropped. Right? Is that what I'm doing? Pre-post, or sorry, schools. The green is where they started. Fine. Yeah. So we have 2 schools starting a little bit higher, 1 starting lower. Maybe that's because of when students get into their programs or not. There might be reasons for that. And we can see if the drops or improvements are the same or different. And our hope is we can start to tie those toward what's happening in the classes. So we're collecting some information about course syllabi. One of our side projects is developing an observation tool. We don't want to make faculty feel too much like they're being researched if they're part of the program, but I think if you are, you might want to know, oh, what am I doing that's helping or hurting, and what are some other people doing? That's really what we're after. It's not meant to be, a bad thing, really. So we can look at some institutions having, bigger drops in self-efficacy than others. So you can see institution 1, quite a big drop. This is biology as well, and institution 4, a lesser drop. Okay, so that's interesting. What's going on there? A little bit more about our institutional, this is UBC data only, looking at our social belonging. We can start to look at across different disciplines. So biology is looking pretty good. The non-binary sample is pretty small, so we tend to just look at the men versus women, but we see differences in some courses, but not others. So in biology, our data often looks much better than in chemistry and physics. So then we start to think, oh, is that the culture? Is that the discipline? Is that the content? Is it the instructional style? Probably a combination of all of those things, but how can we make progress is what we're hoping to do. And then I think this might be the last one, looking at our climate scores. We're still looking at this tool a little bit, but we can see that in this one, the green is women and the red is men, so pretty consistent. So maybe this means, our tool isn't detecting something. Maybe it means classroom climate's not inequitable, which is fine. It's very fine not to find differences in these data, but we'll unpack that a little bit more and look at the relationship, the sense of belonging. Okay, so I only have a few minutes left, but we are absolutely talking to students. That's a really important point of this, because the quantitative work, it tells us something, it gives us a baseline, lets us track things. It often doesn't give us a good picture of the student experience or what we can do. So when we interview students, this is interviewing students who identify as non-binary in chemistry and just about feeling very out of place. So that extra cognitive load of thinking about whether to reveal their identity and how that interacts with their peers and their instructor and so on. So doing interviews is really important. Also looking at open-ended survey questions. So going, and we can code all of these. We don't necessarily have to do interviews, but let's hear from the student's voice what they're saying. So this interesting study that my colleague Karen did mostly is looking at barriers to learning in small groups, getting to that social aspect of active learning. We separated those into some things that are within the student, things that are outside, and then this study was done during online, so it was unique to the online context. Then starting to think, okay, if there's group work structure that helps or doesn't, what can instructor do to help make that structure better? Okay, so our goals, I'm going to wrap up in a second here. We're really trying to create a community of people who feel like they would love to bounce ideas off each other, collect data together, because I think this problem cannot be solved by one person. We want to facilitate collection, interpretation, and action based on socio-demographic data. And hopefully our data will continue to get better over time. It's not perfect, but we are using what we have. We would love to build up this large data set so we can really look at these different effects and do some more interesting quantitative studies. We're also really thinking about our own way we're doing this research, right? Trying to involve students as much as we can. It's often not perfect, but trying to involve that. Thinking about iteratively improving our assessments, which, yeah, that makes it hard to compare and look backwards. But we really want the people who are answering our questionnaires to have a good experience, right? And to see themselves in our questions. And that requires us to change them from time to time. And then sharing these tools and research frameworks and things that we learn in this kind of Canadian context is our goal. So we have these national and local projects, really looking at the structures and aspects of inclusive teaching that affect these change. I'm interested in hearing what you think the most pressing questions are, because we're working on that later grant proposal too. And it's related to some other things we're doing. So one exciting project at UBC is we are creating a science-wide, for now, dashboard for faculty. Once we have that student demographic data project that will, after a course, share disaggregated course data and associated orientation materials. So it's much like if you've heard of the UNC project with Vijay Safi's dashboard, it's much like that. It's essentially that project, doing this at UBC where people feel deeply uncomfortable about it, but we're doing it anyway. And I'm really excited about that. So the key piece will be helping people frame this work and then what to do with it. So you see inequities, what's the plan? What should you try? What does the data or the literature say might help? Thinking about how to track what we're doing in the classrooms to inform this project. And then I've mentioned a few times our student demographic data project, advocating for that, hoping to get really high response rates. And then also there is this tension, collecting the data is good, who should have access, how do we protect privacy? All that is so important. But I think we should get to a place where it's not individual researchers cobbling together a little bit of data from each class. Certainly our situation now is not the best situation, but we're going through a phase of transition, which is exciting. So you can join our group. You don't have to do anything. You could get on the mailing list and you could come to the retreat at the end of June if you want to hear more. If you would like to collaborate as a research collaborator, we're open to that as well. Certainly collecting data at each institution requires an ethics approval, things like that, which we can help you with. And then actually, working with instructors and getting the data. So there's our email. If you want to email, I'd be happy to hear from any of you, and we can just pop you on the mailing list about the retreat. And my time has run out, so I'm going to start with acknowledgements. So again, our seed funding was from our Equity and Inclusion Office, which really launched this whole thing. So I express my gratitude to them every day. Our Work Learn program, we have a lot of students partially funded through them. And of course, our research participants, very important when they're spending their time and they're taking time away from their studies really to do this. But we're learning a lot from them. So hopefully it's time well spent. Well, thank you for listening and happy to take questions if we have time, but I cut it pretty close. Yeah. Okay, thanks everybody.
Just gonna moderate the question.
Okay, great.
We have any questions on Zoom? There is one.
Oh,
you want me to ask?
Oh, yes.
So you asked, does all the collected data come from face-to-face courses, or were any of the sections taught online? I wonder how the difference in virtual, non-virtual format might affect the results.
Yeah, really great question. The data I showed today is all from fall term. All the courses were in person. We did collect some data during the remote, whatever that was called, remote instruction during the pandemic. We didn't really do a lot with it because we knew this was a temporary situation, but certainly that would be a key aspect of a course we would code in. So if people have online courses, that is still a great place to collect this data. Things like the sense of social belonging, I'd be really interested. Is that the same? Is that less? Many of us who were teaching remotely wanted to cultivate that. So perhaps this tool could give a sense of whether we're successful in that. Of course, there's some instructors face-to-face and remote who don't really try to do that, and that's fine too. But if you value that, maybe the tool will work there as well. So yeah, none of these courses were though. And yeah.
Thank you. That was a lovely talk. 1 hour just flew by, and I could have just.
Yeah, it did for me too.
With the data, so you focused on getting the demographic data of the students, and we can talk later. There's a lot of controversial things around this in Australia when we try to do this.
Yes.
One thing is also, what about demographic data of the instructors and their institutes? So you can't be what you can't see.
Yes.
So that sense of belonging is going to be influenced by who's teaching as well. And even with the institutes, things like gender pay gap, looking at the boards and councils. So right at the top at the leadership, because it's what you sort of preach, those institutes, then that all filters down, and you can't just look at the courses and subjects sort of in isolation. So I think alongside that demographic data, if you're not already doing it, we can move to also show the instructors and the institutes.
Yes, so good question. I don't know if I have to repeat it. So really important. So we have talked in our group about, those things we're going to document about all of these classes. Is instructor identity one of them? We haven't yet added that to our ethics protocol. It is something we want to at least track because, when we do these informal analyses, who's in front of the room does really matter. So absolutely. And then I can only really speak for my institution. We've made more progress on the faculty demographic data collection than on the student demographic data collection. And so this is particularly used in search processes. We have an employment equity survey of staff and faculty that's run every year that we have pretty high response rates on. So we're getting a better handle of that group. And then I think with our project, I would like to at least document, so we have as a variable in our database who is in front of that class. But then on the flip side, I'm really curious to hear from people, if they think that would deter your colleagues from participating. Because essentially that is then turning the faculty member into also a research participant. So that has benefits and potential drawbacks, but I don't want to overstate the drawbacks because it might not be as big of a, maybe it's just something to hash out, right? But it's important. Yeah. Good question.
I was interested in a follow-up to, was this done in online courses or in in-person courses? And I was wondering if you intended to pursue that, because whether correct or not, there is a buzz about moving in the direction of having online courses, having online programs, is it cost saving or not for cash strapped institutions, all of that sort of thing. So that would also be a really interesting factor in,
Definitely.
does that disadvantage already disadvantaged groups, or perhaps does it advantage
Mhm.
disadvantaged groups?
Yeah, so far we haven't. If one of our institutions had an online course, we would collect data in it. Just the institutions we had, none of the courses in first year were online. But definitely we would be open to that for sure. And then I think again, like if you want to build up a comparison over time, we'll collect a bigger data set and then be able to look at a group of online courses and a group of face-to-face courses, I think would be a good way to look at that. Mhm. Yeah, because it is a hot topic, as you say. Mhm.
I was curious about the difference in male student and female student performance. It seemed like it was opposite of what I would expected. Is that?
Mhm.
Let's see.
In chemistry where I showed you, let's see. And performance like grades, right? This one. Women are green. Yeah, so the men are doing better.
It gets my bias.
Yeah. That it depends, right? This is just UBC data, right? So I think what's really interesting is when, again, that's not a given, right? We need to look across institutions. And so, you know, on one hand, I really focus on some gender data here. Again, we have all these variables and it's all these institutions. So there's so much to unpack. But we absolutely would love to look at different disciplines within our other institutions and see the extent to which that holds up. And it's interesting because it is maybe counterintuitive. I know at UBC we have about 60% women in our science program. So we're having more students admitted and maybe graduation rates are different. I think we were also pretty surprised that we did see this strong of an effect. So 0.22 and 0.29 are not the biggest effect sizes, but I think it is meaningful if those grades are really important, right? If those open doors or close them, then I'm concerned about that. If it doesn't really matter, right? And no scholarships depend on this, then maybe it's okay. But I think that's why we need to do this at more institutions, because maybe at your institutions it's different. And I'd be so curious to unpack why, right? Is it something about, you know, self-efficacy and confidence, or is it something about incoming? The other thing I didn't go into too much is we don't have yet a culture of some kind of pre-course assessment or start of term assessment. I know a lot of you, if you've done some scholarship of teaching and learning studies, maybe have done something like that, like a concept inventory at the beginning, or using an early assessment as kind of a control or a covariate. So I would like to do that as well, because this could be actually better than it was at the start of term. We don't know, right? And so the extent to which this is good or bad, it's really hard to judge without some measure of incoming knowledge. And a lot of the papers from the US use something like the SAT or ACT. And that used to make me jealous, because I was like, oh, they have like one thing, but those tools are very flawed. That's why fewer schools are using them anyway. So they also have in them a bunch of bias and problematic aspects of it. So I think what would be the ideal scenario is we either have, you know, really on target concept inventories or pre-skill inventories, or we have maybe an early quiz and we can use that as some kind of pre-measure. I would like to build that into our models as well. Because just the difference at the end, remember my first chart had 2, start, end, right? We just have end. So we can use that over time and see if the end is getting better, but it does, you know, only tell part of the story.
Becky, great talk.
Thanks.
I have a question which you've sort of like hinted at a couple of times, you know,
Right.
and that's about grading.
Mhm.
Do you think that grading itself is likely to, you know, make these inequities worse? And if so, you know, couldn't we think about doing away with grades and maybe, especially at the beginning, so you look at first year, so if they Give students time to get used to the university environment without being hammered with grades. And then see what comes of that.
Yes. So I love the movement of that and the idea. I think in practice, it's very challenging to do on an institutional level. I know MIT, they do not have grades in first term. Well, if MIT can do it, surely UBC can do it. And because that we always talk about university transition is so hard, while we're making it worse and not having people explore and learn skills in a way that is, a little bit less stressful, then we'd have to ease into that, right? Not necessarily say, okay, term 2 is this grading horribleness, it's very stressful, but kind of ease into it. So I think that could help. I think, so as long as grades are used for things, we should make sure that we're progressing toward equity. But if you're suggesting there could be a more ideal educational system, absolutely, right? Definitely.
But so I was
Yeah.
asking really whether you would agree with that there is likely to be.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think, we especially, so different things. So we're talking right now about, UBC uses a percent scale, which even more highlights, this is 79 is different than 78. Some schools use letter grades, some pass fail. Medical school at UBC is pass fail. Well, medical school pass fail. That's pretty important to learn things there. So I think there are other models. I'm really intrigued to see as people start adopting them, how that goes, what the evidence is. I'm very open-minded to that. Yeah. But I'm not exactly, so what I won't commit to today, but I might change my mind tomorrow, is that we should do away with grades because there's inequities, right? I think that doesn't necessarily logically follow for me. I think we can still progress toward implementing things that make that tool or that thing more equitable, and then perhaps for everyone there's a better way, which would be less emphasis on grades, if that makes sense. But yeah, and also I'll say one more thing. We talked a little bit about this morning too. A lot of us, but not everyone, uses this kind of point system grading, and it's just what we kind of did in our university, so we then replicate it. There's other ways of coming up with a final course grade that might be different than what we do. So people are using specifications grading or contract grading, things like that, which may still end up at the grade and may enhance students' internal motivation a little bit better, still fit within institutional norms in some ways. And I'm really excited to see where that goes, right? Yeah, we have a few courses in our system that don't really have a high stakes final exam either. So it's interesting to see kind of how that plays in terms of equity. Am I answering your question directly enough? Okay.
So building off of that question, if I recall correctly, I read that BC high schools are getting rid of grading scales. Do you foresee that impacting the future of the data collection that you will be doing for this project? If post-secondary institutions will not be following suit as to what elementary and high school students, institutions will be doing?
I haven't heard that they're doing away with percent grades, but I would love for you to send me whatever information you have about that. I think it would impact admissions, of course, because we base our whole admissions to the institution based on grades, and we have a broad-based system. Just talking about UBC here with, students write essays and things like that. Admissions is very hard. Already, the grades are not great predictors for us because already our median average for science is 95. So we have students coming in all at that super, super top band anyway. So the variation in their grades is not great, and it is not that meaningful as a proxy for knowledge, right? Or learning ability or anything like that. If schools differ, right? And what that grade means differs widely. So I don't think if grades went away in our high school, I don't think it would affect our project at all. That said, it would be really interesting to see if that's successful and we can free high school students from the system of grading, what would they be like as learners when they come to us? And would then this system where things are really entrenched, that grades are really meaningful, be more inequitable, possibly, right? So people have to adjust. So I'd be really interested to see how that goes. We'd certainly adapt to that and ask students about that experience. I think we would still be really keen to understand both the equity and analysis and also that classroom climate sense of belonging piece. But I think this project will kind of evolve and go in different directions, and different institutions like the BC institutions might have to grapple with that. Maybe it's not an issue in some other provinces. That's why the sub projects I think are really useful too, because we're all in our own contexts that are really different, right? So.
Just got one line.
Oh, that's
Cool.
okay.
So I'm curious if there is a way to correct these data for the university population versus the general population. I wonder about struggling students who may not have completed high school, chosen to not go to university, or have dropped out of their university before they completed the survey. Their demographics might seem to be doing fine at the university level, but these surveys can only measure the members of groups who have made it to university science.
Yeah, so I think that's getting into kind of this idea of equitable what, more equitable what. So those questions of access and attainment, super important. It's a little bit outside of the scope of our particular project, but really valuable. And we're also thinking about how to capture course grade lists where we are starting to look at the students who drop and withdraw, because we don't have a good handle on that at this point. So things that are really interesting but challenging in this data set are things like survey response bias, getting the response rates up, accounting for missing data, accounting for the students that aren't there. All of that is super useful. So if a student stayed in for the first survey and then they're gone, are those differences different? But I think looking at access to post-secondary education is in many ways a more important question than what we're doing, right? But we're focusing on the sphere that we have control over as instructors.
That's
So,
one. That's one.
Another one?
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one other online. Thanks for the great talk. How do you think the growing prominence of artificial intelligence technologies like ChatGPT will shape your research and related discussions regarding equity in science education research?
I love this. I feel like it's an interview question.
Exactly.
That was well phrased. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I'd be so curious to talk to you about how the assessment has kind of shifted during the pandemic and then now post, and then with generative AI. I think it's this interesting space, also really complicated. So I think what's difficult is that many of us in our group want to do assessments that are more authentic, more meaningful, and measure something that goes beyond, one's ability to write a test well under pressure, right? And I think we were making so much progress on that during the pandemic when people were like, oh, maybe I shouldn't just do 100 multiple choice questions. Maybe I should get them to do a project. And so much exciting progress. And then in January, when ChatGPT became more of a thing, it was like, oh, maybe my take-home exam is not a great idea anymore. And I do think instructors have a responsibility to promote academic integrity, right? It's not saying you all have to be police officers and like monitor everything, but I don't think a good way is just to continue with, fully take-home exams that are very susceptible to generative AI, because I think that then puts students in this very hard position of like, well, it's not, everybody else is cheating and I'm not, it's very complicated. So we've seen a move, at least at my institution, back to more in-person assessments, away from online assessments, not totally, but many of them. While I straddle kind of two worlds, like the grades are not ideal, and is that really the best educational system too? I think you can measure understanding, and I think you can give people useful feedback when you give them good tasks to work on. So I kind of, depending on the day, I'm more one than the other. So for how it relates to our project, I think it's something to keep in mind in terms of what kinds of assessments we're doing. So if we come up with, oh, this course is using this kind of assessment weighted at this, those types of courses tend to have more equitable outcomes. Verifying if that's a meaningful thing or some kind of artifact will be very useful. So we'll do that. Right now we have, as I said, one class without a final exam. They kind of do this take home project. So I think that may or may not, depending on the structure, be more susceptible to generative AI. I guess you can have a negative opinion of maybe that will make things more equitable. I don't know, right? Because you have more, the information is more equally accessible to everyone, right? The tools, it doesn't rely on your social skills of, oh, do you have last year's whatever, right? Things like that. So it's not a very, I don't have a great answer. It's certainly a really interesting question. I think across higher education in general, generative AI is a really big topic. We'll have to see where it goes. So I have some colleagues who are doing really interesting things, as you probably do too, with getting students to actually work with it in their courses, right? And so that it really works for some courses, right? Yeah, I'll stop there.
So and there's just a request, please put up the slide with the contact.
Oh, yeah.
So it's
Oh.
second last slide deck. So
Good. Our website isn't up, but our emails totally. Yes.
I think that's-
Yeah, sure. If I can jump off of Danielle's question, very related to what you were just asking about AI and the changes. So I'm wondering, I guess if we look at that individual instructor and, you know, we think about their knowledge and beliefs and values, and if we're looking toward educational change ultimately, and Alicia, thinking about some of the work that you've been doing, systems thinking, what some of those, what we need to learn about, what some of the priorities might be around you learning more about the instructor, but also their contacts. So the Department of
Yeah.
Discipline, the faculty, you know, the institution as a whole, the collective agreements, the, you know, all these pieces that fit into how somebody might then change their practices. And so what do you think about?
Well, I will say that all of those things I probably underestimated when we started the project. Because it's really easy, as I had a, you know, pretty long career at UBC, like this is the way things are, and this is not the way things are, right? And I think that is maybe good that we started off pretty slow with just our 5 institutions. Like I mentioned, with one institution, they had to get the approval for the bonus mark from some other person, and that was a surprise to me because at our place we don't have to do that. So those things are what we're learning, and I think it does give, potentially being involved in the project will help people advocate for things. So I'm really excited about our dashboard project. If other institutions are doing something like that, that's great. I don't know of any others. So if we're able to make it happen, I think others can say, oh no, we dealt with all the concerns and weirdness about demographic data and sharing some data with instructors. They're doing it. Here's what they did. Can we do it too? So hopefully some of those institutional differences can, you know, come out. I'm not sure, you know, things in the collective agreement, those can evolve over time, but really slowly. So in terms of who has, you know, decision-making over what, right? Things like that. And I've kind of lost track of your exact question, but yeah. It's late or it's early.
I'm gonna take this chance to say thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.